The T-80 main battle tank is a further development of the T-64. The tank was powered by a gas turbine engine. This was essentially a modified helicopter power plant, adapted for use on tanks. A number of T-64 drawbacks were fixed. The T-80 was adopted by the Soviet Army in 1976. Original version of the T-80 was produced only in small numbers. This was also a more capable and sophisticated alternative to the T-72. The most significant features of the T-80 over the T-72 are its gas turbine engine. It was significantly faster. With the introduction of the T-80, the Soviet Union operated three different main battle tanks, the T-64, T-72 and T-80. All of these tanks had similar design and broadly similar capabilities, though the T-80 was the most capable. However, major components of these three tanks were not interchangeable. It was a tough task for the Soviet Army to support all of these three different tank types altogether. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia operated around 4,500 T-80 main battle tanks of all variants. Due to expensive maintenance, most of these tanks were kept in reserve. Some official sources reported that all T-80 series MBTs were to be removed from active service by 2015. At the time, Russian Army operated T-90 MBTs and overhauled or upgraded versions of the T-72. So the tanks with conventional diesel engines were less expensive to operate and to maintain than the T-80s. However, eventually Russian MOD signed a contract for refurbishment and upgrade these tanks in order to keep them in operational service. In 2022, Russian Army T-80 series tanks were widely used during military invasion to Ukraine. By April 2023, it was documented that at least 460 Russian T-80 series tanks were lost. Other operators of the T-80 and its variants are Belarus, 92, China, 200, Cyprus, 41, Kazakhstan, South Korea, 80, Syria, 320, and Ukraine, 271. The T-80 has a composite armor at the front arc. The T-80 tanks were originally painted olive drab. The tank is armed with a fully stabilized 125mm smoothbore gun. It is fitted with a carousel-type autoloader. The autoloader is similar to that of the T-64 but differs from that on the T-72. The use of the autoloader allowed to reduce internal volume, as well as external dimension of the tank, as the crewman, who loaded ammunition, was no longer required. If the autoloader fails, the gun can be loaded manually the crew. Though in case of manual loading the firing rate is around 1 to 2 rounds per minute. The improved T-80B, which entered service in 1978, as well in later variants of the T-80, can launch Cobra anti-tank guided missiles in the same manner as ordinary munitions. Secondary armament consists of 7.62mm coaxial machine gun and 12.7mm anti-aircraft machine gun. The T-80 has a crew of 3, including commander, gunner and driver. This tank is fitted with the GTD-1000T gas turbine engine, developing 1,000 horsepower. Basically, it is a modified helicopter power plant. It runs on kerosene. Advantages of such engine are its compact dimensions, high power output. The idea to install a gas turbine engine on a tank was not new. However, the T-80 was the first production tank to use such engine. Due to its powerful engine, the T-80 was much faster than the T-72 and T-64, and had superior cross-country performance. The engine can start when the temperature is as low as -40 C. Also, this engine is running more quiet than a diesel engine. However, the gas turbine engine has a number of drawbacks. Most notable is a high fuel consumption. It can consume up to 750 liters of fuel for 100 kilometers driven. Other drawbacks are troublesome maintenance and high unit price. The T-80 is also fitted with auxiliary power unit, powering all systems when the main engine is turned off. Suspension of the T-80 was improved comparing to that of the T-64. Interestingly, several years later the U.S. Army deployed their new M1 Abrams tank, which also had a gas turbine engine. Other countries relied on diesel engines for their tanks. Furthermore, in the 1980s Soviets developed a conventional diesel-powered version of the T-80, the T-80UD, which was planned to become the main MBT of the Soviet Army. Variants: T-80B. First version of the original T-80 produced in large numbers. It entered service in 1978. This tank is capable of launching Cobra anti-tank guided missiles, Western reporting name AT-8 Songster, in the same manner as ordinary rounds. The missiles have radio guidance and a range of up to 4 kilometers. These missiles extend effective range of the tank, as its gun was not particularly accurate at long ranges. Latter variants of the T-80 also had this capability to launch guided missiles. T-80BK, command version of the T-80B, with additional radios, navigation equipment and some other specialized equipment. In order to free up space for this specialized equipment, this variant lost capability to fire anti-tank guided missiles. Also, a number of rounds carried for the main gun was reduced. Production of the T-80BK commenced in 1984 and ceased in 1990. A total of 256 tanks of this type were built. T-80BV is an upgraded T-80B tank fitted with KONTA-KT-1 explosive reactive armor for a higher level of protection. This add-on armor increases protection against heat rounds. In 2011, a total of 66 refurbished Belarusian T-80BV tanks were sold to Yemen. Later these tanks saw combat. By 2020 this was the most numerous version of the T-80, used by the Russian army. The type was actively used during the 2022 Russian invasion to Ukraine. By April 2023 it was documented that the Russian army lost at least 275 of these tanks in Ukraine. T-80BVK. Command version of the T-80BV, with additional communication equipment. T-80U, improved and better protected variant. It was fitted with new KONTA-KT-5 explosive reactive armor. It is estimated that armor protection of the front turret armor on the T-80U is equal to 900 mm against heat rounds and 1100 mm against kinetic energy munitions. The T-80U MBT was originally produced with the GTD-1000TF gas turbine engine, developing 1,100 horsepower. This tank was adopted by the Soviet Army in 1985. Tanks produced in the early 1990s were fitted with a more powerful GTD-1250 gas turbine engine, developing 1,250 horsepower. This version was produced until 1992. T-80UK, command version of the T-80U. T-80UD has gas turbine engine replaced by a conventional diesel engine, developing 1,000 horsepower. Otherwise it is similar to the T-80U. This tank was introduced in 1985 and adopted by the Soviet Army in 1987. It was planned to become the main MBT of the Soviet Army. However, its production ceased in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union. These tanks are currently in service with Russia and Ukraine. A number of Ukrainian T-80UDs were exported to Pakistan in the late 1990s. T-90 uses complete turret with all weapon systems of the T-80U. Mounted on a well-proven chassis of the T-72 tank with a diesel engine, which is more fuel efficient. The T-90 was developed after collapse of the Soviet Union and officially adopted by the Russian Army in 1993. Its low-rate production commenced in 1994. Currently the T-90 is the most modern main battle tank, used by the Russian Army. Also it is among the best 10 main battle tanks in the world. T-80 UM-1 bars has a SHTORA-1 countermeasures system, which significantly reduces the chance of being hit by enemy anti-tank guided weapons with semi-automatic guidance and more powerful engine. It was intended for export customers, but received no production orders. T-80 UM-2, another improved version of the T-80U. As with the T-80 UM-1, it was also aimed mainly at export customers. However, it had a new cast turret and used a DRAS 2 active protection system instead of the Arena. Only a single tank was built and it never reached production. T-80 UE-1 is an upgraded version of the T-80U, fitted with a thermal sight. This version was officially adopted by the Russian Army in 2005. T-80 BVM is a recent upgraded version of the T-80BV, fitted with relict explosive reactive armor and some other improvements. This upgraded version was first publicly revealed in 2017.